Good evening. I am David Ruy. I am the chair of postgraduate programs here at SCI-Arc. Welcome. I'm going to start with two anecdotes as a way to introduce Sarah. The first anecdote was in 1997. There was a conference at Columbia University where I was a student, and it was a conference on Deleuze, I believe, and a Japanese translator of Deleuze, who was a poet, started out the conference by declaring to the audience of architects, "Architecture is my enemy." I thought, my goodness, what a way to start. It turned out to be a little different than what I assumed him to mean. I thought he was going to go on about post-structuralism and oppression and stuff. But actually, he would go on to explain that he's very disturbed by how architecture is so easily mistaken for reality by himself. And he was very apprehensive about architecture's power. And as a poet, he wanted to see past architecture. Therefore, architecture is my enemy. So that's anecdote number one. Anecdote number two is a story I heard about a pretty funky bridge that was proposed in Holland. And it was initially rejected by the city for not meeting certain code requirements. Then, through a bit of cleverness, the artist/architect then resubmitted it 1 year later as an art installation, and it passed, no problem. That always fascinated me, the affordances we give to art and architecture, despite their overlapping conditions, are, in terms of our social expectations, oftentimes radically opposed. And that may, in fact, be unnecessary, perhaps. So, reviewing Sarah Oppenheimer's work this morning, I was very struck by many people who have commented it's difficult to categorize her work. Her sites are often architectural in nature, but maybe buildings might be more precise. I'm kind of curious to know later too, which word might be more accurate. She maybe does work that would be called installations or sculptures by some, but in actuality appear to me to be revisions of buildings, and revisions that wouldn't normally fly, maybe, for social expectations for buildings, whether it's code or merely cultural, stuff that architects may not actually do or have the guts to do or the imagination to do. But her work, revisions on buildings, oftentimes open up seemingly a bit of a black hole or uncertainty in buildings and the architectural that reveal enigmatic conditions of perception and time and space. I don't know if any of us know what that is. Ultimately, is always lurking in the background as a problem. So Sarah Oppenheimer is a very prominent contemporary artist. And she has been working in major institutions. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. She is lecturing at many schools of architecture too. And she is currently a senior critic at Yale in the Fine Arts Department. I believe it's in the painting department, but I'm not sure. But that's it for my two anecdotes. And I'm very curious to see what might be behind the works. The lectures I have seen her give before, I've been struck by precision in speech and thought, which seemed analogous very much to the works themselves. So please help me welcome Sarah.
Hi. So I think the first thing I want to say this evening is I've been thinking a lot about learning. And this talk that I'm going to give this evening is really in some ways about how our process of absorbing our environment at best is a process of learning. And how might we make environments such that learning is a sort of part of our thinking around that process of encounter with the built environment. So with that in mind, let's begin. We sit in a lecture hall. We shift and turn in our chairs, organized in a grid, facing forward. Linked by air, energy transmits across material and immaterial boundaries. Sound resonates. Vibrations reflect across the surfaces of this room. Heat radiates. Light spills from an overhead projector. The moving image overhead flickers on the screen. Specters no longer present. Space scales and time scales intersect and overlap. We are connected. Our environment contains us, and its machines maintain us, creating an entwined ecosystem of context and habitation. How might our presence within these systems remake and reorder their hierarchies and interdependencies? What must be emphasized or obscured, pronounced or removed to amplify our sense of learning, of linkage, of interconnection? FE 2023-0215, Circulatory Pathways, will explore these questions as we map a path through my recent work. Sensitive Machine from 2021, shown here, exhibited at the Wellin Museum of Art, will serve as a landmark in this greater field of inquiry. Sensitive Machine, SM4N, is a hybrid, part human, part digital, part analog. Touch sets in motion a dynamic exhibition system. As visitors manually turn a black beam, a choreography of spatial change is set in motion. Lighting tracks slip between the vertical surfaces of sliding walls. Luminosity levels fluctuate, while sightlines are interrupted and revealed. We sense positional change through tactile sensation and proprioceptive feedback. Touching and turning a black beam imparts a sense of the weight of the object, its changing position, and the way our action has an effect. The beam's materiality, its scale and dynamic resistance shape the gestural action of an operator. We become aware of these ever-shifting networks of exchange at our points of physical contact. Touch transforms. It amplifies our awareness of those rhythms that connect us to our environment. S337473 was my first tactile work. Exhibited at the Wexner Center for the Arts in 2017, a dyad of glass and metal structures were manipulated by visitors, and those human-object interactions produced spatial and perceptual permutations. Watching people touch and turn these elements, I noticed that people began to communicate with one another through gestural contact. Someone would touch a pivoting glass volume. transforming it into a lintel or a beam. Others would mirror those actions and touch it too. The work became a medium through which people connected with one another and with the environment, a transmitter between you and the world and you. Everyone was in the system, and there was also a communication across it. Touch transformed the artwork into a connective tissue. The experience of interconnection is an act of radical imagination. Our minds frequently bridge spaces, times, bodies, sensoria, extending our collective selves across incalculable scale and distance. In 2007, I began to explore our cognitive capacity to link disparate locations in collaboration with the Virtual Environment Navigation Lab at Brown University. The Venn Lab was an early adopter to using virtual reality as a spatial navigation tool. The lab had developed a series of experiments exploring the cognitive mapping of processional space. Test subjects are asked to navigate a complex virtual topiary maze riddled with impossible shortcuts. Much like Pac-Man, the obvious discontinuity shown here, exit screen left, enter screen right, in the diagrammatic plan or section, becomes a learned pathway. It is made experientially continuous when viewed through a perspectival interface in Pac-Man's more current gaming environment. Test subjects in the Venn Lab experienced the spatial continuities of the topiary maze sequentially through stereoscopic perspectival rendering. When asked to draw a map of the space using the mental mapping tools of Kevin Lynch and others, impossible shortcuts were drawn as spatial adjacency. I became interested in translating this virtual environment into an experience of built space. How might the sense of spatial interconnection be heightened or disrupted through the manipulation of processional sequence? For example, if you start in one location, let's see if I can find this mouse. Let's say you start here. I'm going to just show you. Start here, and you walk all the way around to over here, you imagine the distance between A and B to be quite far. By introducing a hole between locations, time is abbreviated. Much like the projection of a remote location on a nearby screen, we experience what was distant as nearby. This experience of interconnection can be manipulated when we consider how spaces are organized. It is much easier to imagine what is immediately to our left or to our right because of our processional gait. It is much harder to understand what is below our feet or what is overhead. I developed a series of works beginning in 2007 which played with the body's capacity to absorb linkage and interconnection. Passing through the 4th floor of the Mattress Factory Museum in Pittsburgh, A milled plywood aperture extends through a third-floor window to the street beyond. 610-3365 brings a remote location into your visual field. When you enter the museum's fourth-floor gallery, the direct linkage to the building exterior allows a visitor to feel airflow, smell rainwater, hear street traffic. You sense this proximity on your skin. You feel the adjacency in a different way. Haptic feedback expands the problem of linkage beyond spatial and visual organization. It incorporates a sensing of the environment and a bodily register of cause and effect. Atmospheres and timescales are interwoven and interconnected. In N01 from 2020, exhibited at Kunstmuseum Thun in Switzerland, I aim to achieve these haptic interconnections through bodily manipulations of built space. A glass and aluminum volume seemingly supported above and below by two opaque white walls divided the museum's entryway. Pivoting a glass volume around an off-center axis slides the lower wall in and out of alignment. Perhaps it makes sense to note here that our screen-based technologies also incorporate haptic registers. No longer do we simply look at the computer screen or the projected image and imagine ourselves elsewhere. Gestural feedback is built into our technological interfaces. Agency is programmed into our tools and technologies. A learned hand gesture, such as swiping left or right, causes an array of seemingly congruous transformations. Rather than default to the black box of a digital interface, N01 uses a human motor to navigate tangible pathways in a built environment. The upper wall volume, moving here, is driven by another visitor, not visible from this vantage point. Here you can see the source of movement. A human motor, shown in the foreground of this image, rotates the vertical glass element, causing the upper white walls in both thresholds to oscillate. Inputs and outputs overlap and interconnect. How do we identify the total shape and body of this networked relay when we are participants in the system? By designing temporal rhythms between things, systems, bodies, we shape the perception of linkage and of interconnection. This is critically relevant to our perception of boundaries in our shared architectural environment. At some times, the glass and wall volumes share a volumetric and planar edge. At others, they slide and disconnect. They perform as discrete systems powered by distal human energy. Observing this relay at a distance, we build different mental maps of linkage and causality. The observer is also a critical participant, a specter reflected in the glass. Organic and inorganic bodies work as an integrated system. To develop this temporal phasing between users and architectural elements, the studio investigated existing technologies. In 2017, I stumbled upon a small mechanism buried in a Van der Kook letterpress. A cam transformed the rotary motion of the handle into the linear oscillation of the vibrator roller. In collaboration with Yale University School of Engineering, we began to manipulate this analog cam technology using digital processes. We projected acceleration curves onto virtual cylindrical volumes to study the dynamic relationship between acceleration and friction. We printed, reprinted, and milled functional prototypes from different materials. In each instance, we assessed how material friction affected overall system functionality. We then inserted these timekeeping mechanisms into dynamic prototypes. Prototyping is an iterative process. It begins on a small scale, allowing the studio to consider how touch shapes the position of the handheld interface. We begin by assessing how the gesture of an activator is entwined with the prototype's movement. As prototypes evolve, activators learn the feel of a surface, its momentum, its reflected inertia. Each iteration allows us to tune the temporal phasing between gestural action and architectural instrument, exploring how movement translates through material and how energy reverberates through a greater system. Experiential space-time does not map neatly onto technical drawings, floor plans, or axonometric projections. Temporal continuity coexists with spatial collapse and collage. Transmitted through tools and technologies, through machines and media, human energy is mediated by a networked array of things. What happens if this network is so vast and so dense that it exceeds and stretches our representational schema? Linkage becomes its own territory, hovering over the space-time of lived experience and architectural drawing. From the network diagram to the technical drawing, from the technical drawing to a data frame, to a physical model, there is an unexpected connection. Phasing is explored in kinetic light models. And prototyped infrastructure tuned and tested in the studio at 1-to-1 scale. Systems evolve. Technical ensembles are camouflaged within the body of the building. The opacity of the mechanism operates as a technical black box. It encourages a process of testing and probing. In contrast to anamorphosis, where a unified view emerges when observed from a single vantage point, there is no single space or time in which all elements align. What appears separate coalesces into a vertical partition. What appears whole separates into parts. We may notice an adjacent wall is moving because it alters our immediate surroundings, blocking or clearing our path through the gallery. But we may be unaware of a lighting track descending overhead. Learning the entwined energetic pathways between input and output becomes an essential part of the viewer's work. Sight, sound, touch, and proprioception suggest modes of knowing based on proximity, resonance, and modulation, where the attuned body is always implicated and situated. In fall 2018, I developed a series of workshops at the Yale University School of Art, also entitled Sensitive Machine, to explore how emerging technologies hold the potential to extend sensing registers across bodies, spatial distance, and bounded locations. This workshop grew out of a collaboration with the artist Annabette Bees, who wonderfully happens to be in the audience tonight. And I want to say I'm very hopeful that our collaboration comes somehow back together as a project for reimagining how this workshop might evolve in the future. But we will see. However, touching on the fields of architecture, mechanical engineering, artificial intelligence, and robotics, Sensitive Machine is an ongoing cross-disciplinary initiative that has led to novel collaborations between Yale's Center for Engineering, Innovation, and Design and the Center for Collaborative Arts and Media. We begin with a series of simple proprioceptive exercises, observing how movement is sensed through different registers. How is sensation transmitted from moving body to moving object and back again? How is gravity navigated when the body is set in motion? Participants are introduced to open source software, which allows them to diagrammatically develop linkage between moving bodies. Turning something here slides something there. These linkages are built. Joints are improvised using readily available materials. Participants collaborate on the design and construction of a prosthesis that extends a gestural motion and allows one body to shape the gesture of another. Teams build a kinetic mechanism with human-powered motors. In each of these systems, there is a material link between input and output, affecting the user's body on a tactile and sensory level. Prosthetics are brought into Yale University's Leeds motion capture studio and attached to the participants' bodies. In contrast to the standard usage of a motion capture studio, in which light-sensitive markers are symmetrically affixed to a single user in predetermined positions, the bodysuit is abandoned. Sensors are now affixed to the apparatus, creating an extended and distorted hybrid body, part participant, part architecture, part instrument. Participants are asked to reimagine the boundaries of objects and their human organism. Much like the instruments in N01 or the networked instruments of sensitive machine, this boundary is no longer self-contained, no longer unified. Participants learn the behavior of this new body by responding to visual feedback projected on an overhead screen. In this short screen capture, a software operator determines which collection of points combines to create a larger object. Clusters of moving points coalesce to become a greater whole. Gesture is extended as one body responds to another. And live motion capture feedback projected overhead operates as a third subject position, an outside observer to an interactive system. Responsive assimilation of this third position informs each participant's mental map. Pathways between tools and technologies empower us to manipulate borders between buildings and bodies. Coordinate systems and architectural drafting conventions are the perfect vehicle for this extension, enabling temporal, material, and structural conditions to be transposed, adapted, and mutated when inscribed in a new time and place. Transposition is apparent when observing similarities in museum architecture. The array of fluorescent bulbs at the Perez Art Museum in Miami is a cloned ceiling detail distributed across a network of art exhibition spaces. Libraries of infrastructural details traverse digital, material, and economic networks, blurring the spatial boundaries of the exhibition space. Artworks are shaped by these architectural dynamics. Let us imagine how the boundaries of architecture might be shifted in turn. S281913, exhibited at the Perez Art Museum in Miami in 2016, was comprised of a pair of glass and metal structures that were physically manipulated by visitors. The lighting grid fixed overhead could be reoriented through gestural contact. Manipulation modulates cycles of illumination. Linear fluorescence interrupts the radiant daylight of Biscayne Bay. Human-object interactions produce spatial and perceptual permutation. Stretching the reflected ceiling plan across a distance, new possibilities emerge along different axial relationships. The energy of human motion intertwines with the frequencies of the environment. NO2, completed in 2022 at von Bartha, Switzerland, is comprised of 3 interconnected instruments. Sliding a black bar modulates the position of the overhead lights. Elongated black lines split and slide, while luminous lights rise and fall. Touch animates the environment, creating cyclical patterns of change. As sunlight diminishes and day becomes night, the gallery's reflective facade is transformed into a transparent window. Light diffuses across the building membrane, and the radiance of the oscillating instruments spills into the street. At the Wellin Museum of Art, daylight is limited. Illumination levels are remote controlled. Lights are programmed to maintain environmental homeostasis. Control boards in nearby mechanical rooms regulate electrical current flowing to overhead fixtures. Museum visitors are unconscious of these energetic relays passing through open air and insulated conduit, perceiving illumination as static and stable. Sensitive machine inserts human energy into the system, linking the overhead lighting tracks with the visitor's gestural energy. The reflected ceiling plan of the Perez has been transposed. A new fluorescent array was powered from existing tracks, allowing for vertical motion in response to human gesture. Grafting instruments to museum infrastructure, our vital energies combine to create hybrid bodies. When instruments are buried in exhibition spaces, network linkages are partially obscured and operate independently from the work's spatial organization. Cams and cables travel through partition walls only to reappear overhead as a crisscrossing array. Vectors form an incomplete diagrammatic map of mechanical action. Because each instrument input and outputs are spatially discontinuous, interconnections between nodes are periodically magnified and distorted by spatial and temporal alignment. Now more than ever, we must consider how spatial proximity and spatial agency are defined? What are the implications of extending pathways across non-contiguous spaces? What are the consequences of augmenting human gesture with new tools and technologies? My work explores these periodic and collaborative dynamics. The work cannot be completed alone. Touch lingers and communicates. Visitors shape the space they inhabit as onlookers learn the extent of their reach. A kinesthetic connection modulates the space in between. Thank you.